Hello people of planet Earth, thanks for coming back for more Starfish and Coffee. My name is Sean Smith and this week I'm taking a detour to talk about one of my passions, which is sharks. We're going to file this one under pseudo pop culture because, well, if talking about the planet and climate change isn't the biggest part of the new pop culture, I really don't know what is. Enter Jodie Rummer. She's an associate professor at PhysioShark from James Cook University in Australia, and her list of achievements is just about as long as my arm. I'll skip over those as you can find them in the show notes where you can go and watch and learn amazing things for yourself. We're joining this one at the crack of dawn on the other side of the world as Jodie gives me some of her background. I hope you enjoy it.
I have been research only for about 9.5 years. That's been a bit of a shift for me and thrown right in the deep end with first year 18-year-olds. They're young, they're keen, they're coping with pandemic. It's crazy. So we are doing face-to-face teaching, but we have a lot of students that are still stranded interstate and relying on online resources. And I think also it's just kind of a different generation in that they're relying on online resources regardless, but even more so with the pandemic. And so they want all of the videos of every lecture posted online. They want notes posted ahead of time. It's a lot. It's
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, they're naive. They're, straight out of high school almost, in a lot of cases. And then two other subjects that are more like third year students, so a bit smaller in numbers. So juggling that and also just revamping all of our research programs for another year of no international travel. So there's that too.
Yeah, my daughter's just finished her first year at uni, and she hasn't seen anybody. Just absolutely online, not seen a soul.
That's brutal. So that's not the university experience, No. You need that 3-dimensional learning environment and
of drinking.
Well, yeah. That is part of it. I never actually left university. Let's face it.
No, how did you get away with that?
Right. Just stayed forever. Just loved learning and just wanted to stay. I love the freedom of being in a university setting, really designing the research program that I want to do. And I mean, of course, I feel like my research is quite relevant and really important to, my little slice of saving the planet. But there is so much freedom in being in an academic setting. If you're a scientific researcher, a lot of freedom. It's great.
You specialize in sharks at the moment, but your larger catchment net is fish in general. Yeah. Yeah.
So, well, my background is physiology. So athletic performance in any organism, really. We think of athletic performance and we think of humans, especially coming off of Olympics and other global sporting events. But I specialize in this athletic performance in all organisms. But I particularly think the fish are pretty amazing. And so broadly, I have focused on the fishes because of all organisms that are on the planet today that have a backbone. Over half of those species are fish. So fish are living on every single aquatic body of water, every single body of water on the planet, spanning from the poles, Antarctica, the Arctic, all the way to the equator, super, super warm water, super cold water. They're doing it all. And we also see such a diversity in performance as well that, in a lot of cases stems from differences in body shape, differences in the pressures that they face in their environment. So I think the fishes are an amazing group of organisms to study, especially if you're interested in athletic performance. And so I think that my career really allows me to bring together my love for sports and adventure and athletic performance for myself, and that's a huge hobby of mine, and just the curiosity that sort of underpins those elite athletes and how they do it, with my love of the marine environment and my my need and passion for conservation, especially in the marine environment.
So did you come to fish after studying human physiology?
I sort of did both at the same time. I would say that my, childhood dream was to be a marine biologist. And then growing up and playing all different types of sports and running, and I danced in a ballet company for many, many years. And then seeing that I could bring those two fields of knowledge together and build a career out of it was just phenomenal, sort of mind-blowing in my mind. And so I would say that probably started with watching documentaries on TV as a kid and just becoming obsessed with the underwater world. And then narrowing that to sharks really came from just some really amazing opportunities since I've been here in Australia. And then also, of all of the fishes, we only have about 1,200 or so shark and ray species, or sharks and their relatives. So sharks and skates and rays, of the 32,000 species of fishes on the planet today. So there aren't as many, even though they seem big and they seem to really occupy our mind when we're in the ocean as well.
Yeah.
But there aren't as many species. And then furthermore, in terms of how they live their lives, it is a lot different than the bony fishes, so the typical fishes. So these cartilaginous fishes, the sharks and the rays, they have longer generation times than other fishes. So it takes them a long time to reach sexual maturity. So, anywhere from 8 to 40 years for them to be the right age to reproduce. And when they do reproduce, they don't produce a lot of young. So, for example, one of the reef shark species that I do a lot of work with, they sexually mature at about age 7 or 8, which, as humans, we would think, wow, that's really young. But for a fish, a shark, that's quite a long time. And then a mother would only maybe have 4 babies, and probably only one survives. And then it takes that survivor, that pup, 8 years to reach sexual maturity. And so this long generation time and really slow growth rate is really, really important when we're thinking about stressors in the environment, which is what I really, really focus on when I'm looking at these different performance traits like climate change. And if you have a long generation time, then it takes many, many, many generations to change the DNA or adapt to the conditions that are changing in the environment. And so we think that of all the fishes, of the 32,000 species of fishes, this subgroup of the sharks and their relatives with their long generation times might not be able to adapt at a pace fast enough to keep pace with how we're changing the planet. So these slow generation times might be an extra source of vulnerability. Plus, we also know that overfishing and exploitation for their fins and their meat and their liver and other aspects of their bodies is actually a big problem for sharks as well. So that's why I've really focused on this subgroup of the fishes in my whole quest to understand fish athletes. Yeah. The subgroup of fishes, the sharks and their relatives, are particularly interesting because I think they're particularly vulnerable.
What's their typical lifespan? I guess it differs between small shark and really large shark, right?
Yeah, absolutely. It depends on the species, depends on where they live. Some of the newest studies that have been coming out about the Greenland shark, finding that it's the longest living animal with a backbone, the longest living vertebrate species on the planet, maybe over 400 years. So
really?
Pretty impressive. Yeah.
Wow. That's blown my mind. That's a seriously long time. Is that this? I know it's not your field, but is that relative to, say, a whale as well? Because they're a mammal. Do they kick around for that sort of time?
Yeah, it would depend on the species as well. Yeah, definitely some of them are super long lived as well. But yeah, it would be quite species specific.
Wow, that's crazy. So when the impact of climate change and overfishing hits the species, they're taking out some really. It's like tearing down the center of a forest with the big oaks and the smaller oaks and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Exactly. Some of these keystone species, predators that are really crucial to the balance of an ecosystem.
Wow. I mean, I was reading today that since the early 70s, the shark population has dropped about 70%. Is that a true fact?
Yeah, I guess it depends on how you're looking at it, but yeah, it has been a tremendous decline. I would say that a tremendous decline. The actual percentage would depend, but yeah, we're looking at massive declines in shark populations, and largely due to fisheries. So yes, we can, as a global population of humans, we can implement rules and regulations to stop that from happening. One of the areas where I work in French Polynesia is the largest shark sanctuary in the world. So there's absolutely zero fishing or exploitation of sharks whatsoever in the 4.6 million square kilometers of ocean that is French Polynesia. And so that's been in place since unofficially around 2007, but like officially 2011 or so. So over a decade or so. And it really is an example to the rest of the world of all of the shark sanctuaries, but then all of the ocean waters in general, as to what can be done in terms of really emphasizing how we can eliminate that number one problem for sharks and their relatives. But we can put those dotted lines around, country barriers and the oceanic waters that surround these countries, and say, okay, within these areas, no fishing is allowed for this particular species or this group of organisms. But we know that the problems that are associated with climate change are crossing those waters, crossing those dotted lines. That doesn't matter at all. And so I think that's where we are really emphasizing the next chapter of our research as a global scientific community is seemingly this number two threat for sharks and their relatives, because we as a global human population, we can make the rules to stop fishing from occurring, and we can really work on that. But no matter what kinds of dotted lines we're putting around these country barriers, we can't stop climate change. We can't stop ocean warming from crossing those lines.
Is the whole world actually on board with the project? It never seems like it is. It always seems like the Western world is kind of on board with it. But when it comes to maybe China or Japan, it's kind of like, they don't really care so much. That's how it appears to me. Would that be fair?
Yeah. We do really need to get the buy-in from, the other extremely developed and extremely powerful countries in this world, for sure, and those that have a lot of coastline, and those that are very much relying on fisheries trade for massive industry. We are not even close to being there, but that, yeah, like I think that's a really, really tough problem. I have a lot of colleagues with World Fish that are working on that as well. And then there's that balance between, fisheries in developed nations, such as China and Japan, that have this massive technology to be able to, harvest millions and trillions of tons of organisms from the oceans at a rapid rate, and then compare that to tiny little island nations that depend on fish perhaps as their only source of protein and even sort of a currency in terms of trading for resources and really sustaining their communities. So you have this, quite bimodal distribution of how resources are utilized and even exploited based on wealth. So I think when we are looking at fisheries issues, that's, I guess, distribution of wealth is probably one of the biggest issues there, and education.
It can get quite depressing very quickly when you dig.
Yeah, it certainly can. It certainly can. And, wanting to solve all the world's problems, it's not a one-person show. I work with an amazing group of scientists here at James Cook University. I'm in the College of Science and Engineering, and also with the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Coral Reef Studies. So we've got this massive team, not only of biological scientists that are looking all the way from, ecosystem ecology, so big communities of ecosystems on the reefs and in the oceans that are at balance under certain circumstances, and from fisheries, from individual species and organisms, all the way down to the molecular level of these individual species and organisms, and what kinds of changes are needed to be made at that molecular level to cope with stress. But then also, we've got this amazing group of social scientists as well that are working with us, that are really trying to understand how people's attitudes and actions and day-to-day activities are impacting how we utilize the planet's resources and how that can be done in a really sustainable way. So it is very, very much turning into one of the most multidisciplinary and integrative, fields of work, fields of research that's needed right now in this contemporary world that we call the Anthropocene.
And it's hard to turn such a big truck around in the middle of the road, isn't it? I mean, about 3 or 4 years ago, I launched a project to fund moving some bears that had been in bile farms out to sanctuaries in Romania, things like that. And it kind of went okay, but what I discovered was it's hard to make people care when, A, there are no bears in the UK, so nobody cares. B, there's none in Europe, or not over this side anyway. So, you're in the States, you've got Colorado, places like that, sure, but it's kind of a minority, and it's hard to reach enough people who care. And I guess when you're dealing with fish, if you don't live by the ocean, you could care less, right? It's all about what's in front of you on a grand scale.
Yeah, what's in your backyard? Absolutely. I was just looking for some of the notes. We just did this big piece in the conversation, so the global conversation. Done some pieces for the Australian conversation. Of course, you have the UK version of the conversation as well. But
I've not heard of that. What is it?
The conversation is a really, really cool website, and kind of combines scientific perspective in a journalistic way, addressing these global issues. And usually a couple of scientists are on board writing a very journalistic editorial type piece about an issue. And the conversation recently did a piece highlighting each of the oceans on the planet and sort of the big problems each of the oceans are facing right now. And so I did the one about the Pacific, and we talked about plastic pollution. We talked about fisheries or overfishing. We talked also about ocean acidification. So one of the sort of lesser known, lesser appreciated problems that's associated with climate change that the oceans are facing. And so that's the absorption of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by the oceans, and the resulting decrease in pH that occurs in the oceans due to that chemical reaction. And I mean, I think that that's a really great way to get across to a global audience the impact that, even if you're not right on the Pacific Ocean, for example, or you're not, living in a coastal city or town, that everything that happens in the oceans is affecting all of us 100%. And so, yeah, I mean, I would highly recommend taking a peek at the conversation.
I will.
Really, really well written, much more in an editorial, non-jargon style of rhetoric, and addressing these massive global issues, and not just from an environmental perspective, but society and ethics and policy, and so anything that's really going on in the world right now. But they always have a couple super keen, super intelligent scientists on board from various universities that are kind of fact checking and a lot of the information.
How does climate change is a whole other thing. We could sit here for 3 or 4 hours, right? But how does it affect the sharks in particular? Because you look at them and you think they're these hugely resilient beasts, but I guess they have the same rules as any fish, much as humans do. You can be 6 years old or a 20-stone wrestler, but you're still subject to the rules of being a human being. So,
I guess in the most simple form, one of the factors we look at quite a bit with climate change in the oceans is ocean warming. And I would say the majority of the organisms in the oceans are what we as kids used to call cold-blooded. As scientists, we call them ectotherms. And essentially that means that their body temperature is reflecting the temperature of their environment. Okay, so if they're living in 25 degrees Celsius water, their body temperature is 25 degrees Celsius. So what we also know from basic biology is that all the reactions in our body, and so we regulate our body temperatures pretty tightly to 37 degrees, but all the reactions in our body and in a fish's body are quite sensitive to temperature. And so while a fish is just letting their body temperature kind of go with the flow in terms of their environment, we are spending a lot of energy to tightly regulate our bodies. So if you're looking at a fish, they would have to be okay with their rates in their body, like their metabolism and how their enzymes are functioning and digestion and all these important physiological mechanisms in their body also shifting with temperature. And in biology, there's this sort of general rule or general pattern that suggests that for every 10 degrees Celsius increase in temperature, rates in the body will double. And now that's a really big generalization. Some rates will triple, some rates will less than double. And so you do get quite a wide variety of how rates in the body will respond to elevated temperature.
Yeah.
And it also depends on the species as well. So if you have a species that lives near the equator all of its life, well, the equator is warm, but the equator doesn't see a lot of seasonal variability in temperature. So we're not getting spring, summer, winter, fall. We're not getting all the 4 seasons and all the variability in temperature that would happen with the 4 seasons. But they are getting warm temperatures, but very narrow range of temperatures. So we would suggest that those fish species, they're going to have fluctuations in their body with the temperatures that are fluctuating on a day-to-day basis, but it's going to be pretty tight. And now we look at a fish species in a temperate area, let's say off the coast of Sydney or even off the coast of the UK, and they're going to get that wide seasonal variation in temperature. And so that wide range of temperatures, their body has to be really good at functioning across that wide range of temperatures. And maybe as the seasons are changing, their body starts to acclimate to those new temperatures and sort of readjust and use energy to do that. So if we are looking at different species, it depends on where they live. It also depends on how much energy it requires them to cope with these temperature changes. and the cost that's associated with ramping up the rates of metabolism. Okay, if you ramp up your metabolism, you need more food. Okay, so there's lots of factors that contribute to those effects of temperature if we're looking at a fish in the ocean, for example. Now, on a short-term scale, what we are seeing with climate change is the increase in frequency and increase in severity of global heat waves. That happens in the oceans as well. Okay. In the past 6 years here on the Great Barrier Reef where I work, we have had 3 incidents of global heat waves. And that's resulted in what we know as coral bleaching. So the Great Barrier Reef bleaching, and essentially coral is dying. And so those short-term periods of time where temperatures are warmer than usual because of ocean warming, and then they stay warm for a period of time because we're going through a heat wave, then those organisms, if they aren't able to make those adjustments in their body on a really quick scale, then it costs them more energy to be alive, and ultimately it could be death, it could be mortality. Best case scenario, it's just costing them a lot more energy, and maybe that energy is taken away from reproduction. So maybe another generation isn't secured. So that's on a short-term basis.
Okay.
Now, on a longer-term basis, what we would look at, as I mentioned earlier, is adaptation. And so that's over multiple generations. So as a habitat warms incrementally over time with ocean warming, we are already looking at around a degree of warming in the oceans since the Industrial Revolution. Degree doesn't seem like a whole lot, but a degree of warming is what killed 2/3 of the Great Barrier Reef over the past few years. So it is a big deal. So over time, what does a degree of warming mean for generations of fish? Can they change their DNA over those generations to adapt to those new conditions? Okay, some may be able to do that, some may not, and some may be able to do it rapidly, and some may not be able to do it rapidly enough. And that's when we might see either species start to disappear or relocation. So could they find cooler, more favorable conditions, a new habitat to relocate to?
You took the question right out of my mouth, which was,
exactly.
Are some of them smart enough just to move house?
Well, if there's habitat available for them, we've got this amazing project that's been going on in Australia and has taken a global perspective as well, that's called Species on the Move. And it's largely run by this amazing professor, Professor Greta Pessel, who's out of Tasmania. And she's also incorporated what's called a citizen science project with that as well, where just the general public are helping to identify species and where they are. And the overall finding so far has been the documentation of species in the oceans that are moving out of really warm habitats to cooler habitats as a result of climate change. So this geographic relocation of species, some may be able to do that, but if you have a little goby fish that only lives on one kind of coral, well, if that coral isn't available in cooler waters, then that's not an option for that fish. So yet largely it sounds great, just move, and we kind of joke, oh yeah, Sydney just wants the Great Barrier Reef, or the Great Barrier Reef is going to move to Tasmania, but it's not that simple, and it's absolutely not 100% possible either. There's so many elements involved in ecosystem balance that would really preclude that from being a solution. But it is one of the options that we look at as scientists. We kind of talk about 3 options for a species: adapt, move, or die. Okay, the third one being the least desirable. Obviously, we don't want species to completely disappear from the planet, but do they have the capacity to change their DNA over generations fast enough to keep pace with the changes that are happening in their habitats?
But that's not ideal either, is it? That's not ideal because if they adapt, it stops it stops you from focusing on the climate change problem. If everyone kind of went, oh, okay, the fish are adapting, let's not worry so much about this issue, and then it just progresses and it'll never be fixed. That's not a fixable way, is it?
Absolutely. I mean, I would think that in some of these cases, looking for the super coral and, engineering corals that are really heat tolerant to, reestablish the Great Barrier Reef with these super corals. I think that's, a bit of a straw man argument, in that what we really need to be focusing on is the elephant in the room, and that is climate change. Sometimes it just seems like such a big, vicious problem to cope with, to deal with as an individual. But I think that that's where we collectively, as a global society, that's where we need to really put the pressure on policy to, not be approving any more fossil fuel developments at all, and relying more on clean energy than ever before, and incentivizing that at the federal level and at the global level as well. Incentivizing good habits in terms of energy and clean energy especially, but also punishing bad habits that we know are damaging the planet right now.
It all sounds very expensive.
Yeah, I guess it could sound expensive. It turns out right now in Australia that clean energy such as solar has become cheaper than coal. So, we need to also be communicating that to the general public as well, that we have seen a massive shift, and collectively, we have the brain power, we have the intelligence. Here in Australia, we invented Wi-Fi, we can do this. And we're just a small country compared to the rest of the world. But collectively, the whole world putting our brains together, we've got the intelligence to solve this problem. And then it's really where we need to emphasize that to our local governments, our federal governments, and then at a global scale. Looking at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change with their new reports that have just come out, the United Nations and their decisions. We were facing that not too long ago here on the Great Barrier Reef, where the United Nations wanted to put the Great Barrier Reef on the at-risk list as a World Heritage Site. And there was so much pushback from our government here in Australia. It's going to ruin tourism. It's going to ruin the industry. Well, no, we actually need that wake-up call here in Australia to say, we're not doing a good enough job at addressing the number one problem for the icon of this country, and that's the Great Barrier Reef. And if we want continued support by the United Nations, then we need to do better. So we need those wake-up calls. 100% we need those wake-up calls. And we here in Australia, we need to be able to show that to the rest of the world. What do you think of when you think of Australia? You think of kangaroos, maybe the Sydney Opera House, the Great Barrier Reef, Finding Nemo, the largest continuous coral reef ecosystem on the world that you can see from space that's the size of Italy. Come on. So can we not say that to the rest of the world? We know that we are a small country, but we are going to do everything that we can to demonstrate to you all that we respect the importance of this ecosystem to the health of this entire planet.
I'm going to have to disagree with you on that small country bit.
It's big in size, okay? Land mass, it's pretty big.
Yeah. I think we had 3 days this year where all of the UK's power came from wind turbines, and they switched the grid off. It was enough, which is compelling evidence that it can work, especially if each country uses what it has, out there, solar may be your big thing, I guess, rather than wind.
Yeah, more solar for sure. Mm-hmm.
Let's just backtrack a little bit. I just wanted to touch on technology and how it's transformed what you do. I'm guessing it's come on leaps and bounds in a very small amount of time, like tech has everywhere else, yeah?
Absolutely. I think that working in more of a multidisciplinary and integrative approach to our science, working with IT geniuses that are, coding legends and engineers, software engineers for sure as well, has really allowed us to do our research a lot more effectively and to really zoom into a lot of the traits that we're measuring with our research. And that's just on a fine scale. I mean, that's just with my research team looking at athletic performance in, sharks and other fish. We use a lot of this similar technology that's used in humans. Like if anyone has a smartwatch, it's got a little accelerometer in it, same as in our phone. Well, we sort of redesign those tiny little accelerometers and we chuck them onto a shark. And then we can monitor their activity levels just in the same way my watch is telling me I need to stand because I've been sitting too long. So we are really trying to adapt a lot of the human technology, especially those technologies for athletes, to our sharks and other fishes to try to understand a little bit more about how they're performing in their habitats and how different stressors that are associated with climate change are impacting those performance traits. And then working with these amazing modelers that write this code into their computers, and they're able to understand how one change in one population of one species can affect an entire ecosystem. So it's pretty tremendous to be able to work with all of this technology, but then also with these multiple areas of expertise all coming together, I think, for kind of the same goal, really wanting to emphasize conservation and biodiversity and a healthy planet, from one angle or another, really.
I mean, I've watched about 15 shark documentaries this week because I knew I was doing this with you. And it seems to be that what you're missing is which is amazing, which is the depth. When the sharks go low, you lose the satellite signal, which is crazy when you can beam pictures back from Mars.
I know.
Okay.
I know.
So
it's really like where are the priorities at this point? Yes, space exploration is incredibly important and so amazing and so cool. And in fact, one of my close friends went marine biology, and then now she's an astronaut. So
is it important?
Is it important? I think it is.
It's not as important, though, is it? Not really.
No, I think it's all important. We've got these amazing minds that are working with places like NASA and the equivalent there in the UK, and looking at those technological advances that, okay, maybe we don't see them directly coming from popping up to the International Space Station or something like that, but I know that Jessica was learning how to grow, crops in space, for example, and, different ways of how our bodies work under zero gravity and, how we can more sustainably produce food for ourselves. And so, there are a lot of, I guess, transferable ideas that we might be needing to look at into the future, even here on the planet. But yeah, I think collectively the world has so many amazing brains that if we really did emphasize some of these big issues and put the money in those places, I mean, funding is so hard. It is really, really hard. And you wouldn't think it would be so hard for research on baby sharks, which I predominantly work with. Okay, so they're really cool, really cute, really important to the health of an ecosystem, and then also climate change. I mean, we all know there are a lot of people that don't have the buy-in, of course, but we all know that is the number one problem that biodiversity on this planet is facing, whether you're on land or in the ocean. But it's hard. We're starting to rely on private donors now for our research because the emphasis at the government level is not there. And that's a sad reality. How do we make that change? How do we put that pressure on our governments to fund these things that are really important to the future of the planet?
Funny that thing you're saying about the government not wanting to close the barrier reef because of tourism. It's pure Peter Benchley in Jaws. It's just you keep the beach open at all costs. And it's a high cost. It is. Taking another left turn, I just want to touch briefly on women in ocean science, which is where I found you. It's a great movement, but is it working?
Is it working?
I guess it's going to take time.
Yeah, how would we know if it's working? We're getting there. We are making movements to have equity in the STEM fields. So all of the science, technology, engineering, medicine, mathematics, these science fields. There has been a massive brain drain in the science fields for decades upon decades. We don't see the highest level, say here in academia, females. Very few full professors, maybe not as dramatically in the marine sciences as, say, engineering. That's tends to be worse.
Yeah.
But yeah, globally, probably looking at about 23% female in the biological sciences in terms of positions.
But that must be an improvement on 2000, 1990 maybe.
It definitely has gotten better. I know that when I was going through university initially, and as I mentioned earlier, I haven't left university. It's where I work. But yeah, looking for female role models. I had maybe one female professor during my bachelor and master's, and she was a botanist, and I think she just had it too. I think she was over it. I think she was sick of being the only female in the department, and strapped with probably way too much teaching. And then when I transitioned to my PhD, I remember getting mentoring from this amazing woman called Trish Schulte, and she really led the path, and she really sort of opened my eyes in terms of how difficult it was for her. She's an extremely successful molecular biologist genius in terms of understanding those things that we were discussing earlier, like adaptation at the molecular level under these stressors like climate change. Just brilliant. But that was sort of the first conversation I really had. And then looking back after talking to her during my PhD and thinking, oh, actually, I didn't have female role models sort of growing up academically. And I think that's where we are seeing the change. And now with my eyes open, since I started my position here at James Cook University 10 years ago now, I have made it my mission in this past decade to be that face and voice of what it means to be a scientist. I mean, if you Google scientist, you probably still will get the image of an old white bald guy in a lab coat. Yep. No, I mean, a scientist has lots of different sizes, shapes, and we're not even just looking at two genders. So we're really, really reaching out for a lot of equity in terms of gender equity within the LGBTQ community as well, ethnic and religious equity, because we are missing out on so much intelligence if we exclude. So, all these world problems that we've been discussing, we're going to miss a lot of those key solutions that could be, as cliche as it sounds, critical to saving the planet if we're not, providing a safe and amazing space for all kinds of scientists to contribute. So that's where I do see change happening. I do see the faces and voices of what it means to be a scientist becoming a lot more diverse and a lot more equity there. But we still need changes at the very upper echelons of those levels. And those changes definitely reflect a systemic problem that it is a male model. I mean, especially here in academia. So, women that want to start families, for example, and are at the peak of, applying for tenure and big, huge grants and trying to publish as much as possible, that's not a great time to try to prepare your body to have a family, for example. And this is just one example of where a gender imbalance can really impact productivity and success in this old model of what it means to be a successful academic in science. So we have to change that model, and we have to change what those metrics look like in terms of being successful. So is success based strictly on this climbing the ladder and publish or perish and get these big, huge grants? Or is it mentoring your students and advocacy within your community and service within your community and, citizen groups and, other ways of contributing as a scientist that might not be that older model of climbing the ladder. And so shifting the timeline of success as well, and also creating a really safe space for flexibility in the, academic trajectory as well. So conferences having childcare facilities, for example. I mean, for an entire family to go to an international conference, so one member of that family can present at that conference. That's a huge expense. That's a lot on that family. So those are types of changes that are happening right now. And then eventually that has to also happen at the policy level. And so we have to be looking at judging these key performance indicators in a very different way than they were judged, say, 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah.
Even 20 years ago, to be honest, 10 years ago.
I think these things just take patience. The ball has started rolling. But what needs to happen now with this, and I also see it in the Black Lives Matter movement, is that generations have to turn over. The way our parents thought is not the way our children think. And Absolutely. Those generations need to turn over again and again until it becomes normal and people look back and go, was it really like that? Yeah, it was.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I talked to one of my older mentors who some would call the father of fish physiology. He wrote all of my textbooks, sort of growing up academically, the textbooks I studied when I was doing my bachelor's degree. And he's 83 this month, I think, or next month. And he said, you know what? It was so easy back then. I wasn't competing with half the population. It was easy for me to land my faculty job because there wasn't very many of us even looking for it. And I wasn't competing against women. They weren't there. And, that was kind of an eye-opener as to what it was like, I guess. And I think he fast-tracked all of his academic degrees. So he was probably, early 20s or so when he was looking for that first faculty position. So, yeah, I mean, that was a while ago. And he said, yeah, it was easy. There were not women in this field at all. So that's pretty eye-opening. So then it's interesting to see and hear what he thinks about the changes that are made now. And I mean, it is definitely generational. So with this new generation emphasizing diversity and equity, justice in the STEM fields and sciences, especially, close to my heart, the marine sciences. Yeah. We will see change happening, but we have to keep on it. We absolutely do. And we have to be looking at the whole situation through a different lens than was used in our, predecessors for sure.
Do you see it? Do you actually, in the time that, well, you've been there forever, haven't you? So you'll know the answer to this. Are there more women interested now than 10 years ago? Is it obvious?
That's never been an issue. In marine science, the gender balance is in favor of females, and it has been since I started as an undergrad. Typically around 60% female, 40% male. And the shift happens later. So the shift happens in sort of the junior faculty time. So if you think of bachelor's students, we're at that definitely female dominated for marine science, even into the PhD, still female dominated. Postdoctoral, which is like a residence, in the medical world, it's like the residence for us. Still probably pretty close, probably still in that 50-50. And then junior faculty, you think of like an assistant professor, first faculty position at a university. And then we start to see the females trickle out a little bit. Tenured professor, so associate professor, definitely starting to lose the females. And then full professor, they call it the scissor curve. So it seems like females are high and then go low, and the males are low and then go high in terms of the percentages. And at that inflection point in the middle, it seems to be that critical time, which for a female, that would probably be age 34. So makes sense. It absolutely makes sense. And, without that support, and then, without other females being there to be like, no, we can do this. We can make this happen. We need to keep you. You're important. Your viewpoint, your perspective, your approach is key to your science. Without those females helping that along, then, we lose it.
But you are the role model now. That's it.
Mm-hmm.
The only one.
Well, that's why I do as many speaking engagements as I can. That's why
stupid podcast interviews.
I do podcasts. I wouldn't call it stupid. I do a lot of media because I do want, this next generation, that maybe it's the young, 9-year-old with an interest in science, or first-year university student that's not really sure, and to be able to see me and say, I could be like her, because I never got that. And I had to, sort it out for myself. I made it, but it wasn't easy, and it's still not easy. We still see these issues that happen. There's a great documentary that's now out on Netflix called Picture a Scientist. And we had a screening of it here at the university a few months ago. And still, you would be preaching to the choir, because a lot of people that would come to this screening would sort of already be in the know as to equity and gender imbalances within the STEM fields. But still, people's minds were blown. And in terms of, things that have happened, unfair policies, how women have been treated, how women, and even my partner asked me this, and because he knows, he was like, you do like reread your emails about 6 times before you send them to make sure that you don't sound bitchy or bossy. I'm like, I know, I do that because that would be the immediate response as a senior female that's successful, that I would come off as full of myself or bitchy or bossy or, telling someone what to do. And so I tone down everything I do for that reason. And he called me out on it. He said, you totally do that. No, I still do that. But, some of these things just become ingrained because it's survival. It very much is. I remember being interviewed for my position here, and someone said, I heard them say, wow, she's full of herself. Okay.
She's American.
Right? It must be. She's female and she's American. I've been living in Canada for 7 years, to be fair, but...
Oh, what would Jacques Cousteau make of it all?
Oh, a glass of red wine solves everything, right?
Probably, yeah. Did you know, I didn't know this till about an hour and a half ago, that he wanted to be a pilot. I never knew
Really?
that. He wanted to be a pilot and was in a car crash, which just completely took that off the table for him. And he took to the water for physio. Who knew?
Oh.
Not me.
Well, I have a few marine biologist friends that are pilots, so maybe there's this transferable interest.
Anything just to get off the planet.
Yeah, right. Depths of the ocean, altitude into the sky. Well, I love hiking, and I'm a climber, so maybe there's something there.
Yes.
I love rock climbing, and anything to get to the peak of something with a beautiful view.
Hey, listen,
Yep,
thanks.
definitely.
Thanks for doing
Pushing
this.
the
It's been
limits.
great. Thank you very much for your time anyway.
Thank you so much. It was great chatting with you.
Maybe we can do it again.
I would love that. I would love
Good.
that.
Good. Thank you very much.
Cheers.
Have a good day.
Bye-bye.